Sometimes the things we rescue end up rescuing us instead. When loneliness weighs heavy on a man's heart, even the smallest act of kindness can change everything. Hank Barlow had spent decades alone on his Arizona ranch carrying wounds that time couldn't heal. One scorching afternoon, he found a dying pup tangled in barbed wire near an abandoned trail. The weathered cowboy couldn't walk away. He brought the creature home, nursed it back to health, and named it Dusty. For months, man and animal formed a bond deeper than either had known in years. But as Dusty grew, something wasn't right. The way it moved, watched, and howled at the desert moon. This wasn't any ordinary dog. What happens when Hank discovers the truth? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from today, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The desert sunrise painted the Arizona sky in shades of ember and rust, colors that matched the weathered hands wrapped around Hank Barlow's coffee mug. 58 years of desert living had carved lines around his gray eyes, like the arroyos that spiderwebbed across his land, each one telling a story of endurance. His ranch sat 30 miles from the nearest neighbor, a deliberate choice that had served him well in recent years when silence became his closest companion. The faded family photograph on his kitchen table caught the morning light, its cracked glass reflecting fragments of a life that once filled these rooms with laughter. Sarah's smile beamed up at him from beneath the splintered surface, her arm wrapped around a gap-toothed 8-year-old Emma who clutched a stuffed horse tight to her chest. Hank remembered taking that picture 20 years ago, back when his wife's garden bloomed with desert marigolds and brittlebush, when Emma's voice echoed across the canyon as she chased lizards through the sage. 5 years had passed since cancer took Sarah from him. 5 years since the last time he'd heard Emma's voice without the weight of disappointment hanging between her words. The phone hadn't rung in 3 months, not since their last stilted conversation when she'd called to tell him about her engagement to some attorney in Phoenix. He'd hung up feeling like a stranger in his own daughter's life, wondering when exactly. He'd stopped being the man she could turn to for comfort. The silence used to eat at him in those first months after Sarah's funeral. He'd find himself talking to her empty chair at the dinner table, asking her opinion about which fields needed irrigation or whether Emma would ever forgive him for the drinking that had followed her mother's death. But grief has a way of settling into a man's bones, like sediment in a riverbed, and eventually Hank had learned to carry the weight without buckling under it. His daily routine had become a meditation of sorts. Dawn meant checking the water tanks and counting cattle across the 600 acres that had been in his family for 3 generations. His grandfather had carved this spread from pure desert grit and determination, and his father had expanded it during better times when beef prices stayed steady and droughts didn't last for years. Now Hank ran a smaller operation, just enough cattle to keep the land working and his hands busy. Doc Martinez from the neighboring spread stopped by every few weeks, ostensibly to check on the shared fence line, but really to make sure Hank hadn't succumbed to the isolation that claimed so many men their age. At 72, Doc had buried 2 wives and understood the particular loneliness that comes from watching the people you love disappear one by one. They'd sit on Hank's porch as the sun set, sharing a beer and talking about everything except the empty spaces in their lives. "You ought to get yourself a dog," Doc had said more than once. "Man needs something that'll greet him at the end of the day." Hank had always deflected the suggestion. After losing Sarah and watching Emma drift away, the idea of opening his heart to another creature that would inevitably leave him seemed like inviting unnecessary pain. Better to tend his cattle, fix his fences, and find peace in the reliable rhythms of ranch work. The desert had taught him patience over the decades. Unlike the green valleys back east where Sarah had grown up, this landscape didn't give up its secrets easily. You learned to read the subtle signs, the way morning shadows fell across certain rocks, how the wind carried different scents before a storm, where the ancient saguaros stored water in their massive arms. The land demanded respect, and in return it offered a harsh kind of honesty that Hank had come to appreciate. His cattle had adapted to the environment over generations, becoming as hardy and independent as the man who tended them. They knew which waterholes lasted through the dry months, and which patches of grass would sustain them when the rains failed. Watching them navigate the challenges of desert life had taught Hank something about resilience, about finding ways to survive. When the world around you grew hostile and unforgiving, the workshop behind his house held the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of ranchers. Hand tools worn smooth by countless hours of use, leather tack that his father had made by hand, and the kind of mechanical knowledge that came from decades of making do with what you had rather than buying new. Hank could rebuild an engine, birth a calf, or doctor a sick animal with equal skill, talents that had been passed down like family heirlooms. But the workshop also held reminders of plans that never came to fruition. The rocking horse he'd started carving for grandchildren he might never meet, Sarah's pottery wheel, dusty now, but still positioned by the window where she'd loved to work in the afternoon light. The unfinished birdhouse that Emma had abandoned during her last visit before the accident that had driven her away for good. That accident still haunted him. Emma, 18 and home from college for Christmas break, had taken one of the horses out for a ride without telling anyone. When she hadn't returned by sunset, Hank had gone looking, his heart hammering with the kind of fear that parents know but can't adequately describe. He'd found her pinned under her fallen mare near the old mining trail, conscious but trapped, and in that moment when he wasn't sure whether his daughter would live or die, something fundamental had shifted inside him. She'd recovered fully, but the experience had changed them both. Emma became more cautious, less willing to take the kinds of risks that had defined her childhood on the ranch. And Hank became more protective, more prone to worry about things beyond his control. The dynamic between them never quite returned to its easy familiarity, especially after Sarah's death, when grief made them both more fragile and less able to bridge the gap that had opened between them. Now, as he sat in the kitchen where so many family breakfasts had unfolded over the years, Hank wondered if the silence he'd grown comfortable with was really peace, or just another form of hiding. The photograph seemed to ask questions he wasn't ready to answer, about whether a man could get so used to being alone that he forgot how to be anything else. Outside, the desert was waking up. Coyotes called to each other across the distant ridges, their voices carrying stories of the night's hunt. Road runners skittered between the creosote bushes, and somewhere in the distance a great horned owl offered one last haunting call before seeking shelter from the coming heat. This was the music that had replaced human conversation in Hank's life, and most days it felt like enough. But lately, something had been different. 3 months ago, when he'd found that dying pup tangled in barbed wire near the old mining trail, his first instinct had been to walk away. The smart thing would have been to end its suffering quickly and move on with his day. Instead, he'd found himself carefully freeing the tiny creature from the wire, wrapping it in his jacket, and carrying it home like a man who still believed in second chances. Dusty had been near death, dehydrated and weak from exposure. Hank had set up a bed for him in the mudroom, feeding him water from an eyedropper and gradually introducing small amounts of food. For weeks, he'd checked on the pup every few hours, monitoring his breathing and watching for signs of recovery. The veterinary skills he'd developed over decades of ranch work served him well, but it was something else that kept him invested in the animal's survival. A recognition of kinship, perhaps, or simply the understanding that they were both creatures who had learned to endure. As Dusty grew stronger, Hank found himself looking forward to their interactions in ways that surprised him. The pup's eager gratitude, his quick intelligence, and his obvious attachment to his rescuer filled spaces in Hank's daily routine that he hadn't realized were empty. Here was a being who asked for nothing more than food, shelter, and the occasional scratch behind the ears, but who offered something invaluable in return, a reason to come home each evening, a presence that made the silence less complete. Now, as he finished his coffee and prepared to start another day, Hank could hear Dusty stirring in the mudroom. The sound brought a small smile to his weathered face, the first genuine expression of contentment he'd allowed himself in longer than he cared to remember. Whatever Dusty was, and Hank was beginning to suspect the animal was something more complex than the usual ranch dog, he had given an old cowboy a reason to believe that rescue could work both ways. The desert light was shifting from gold to white as the sun climbed higher, and Hank knew the day's work was waiting. But for just a moment longer, he sat with the photograph and the sounds of an awakening landscape, allowing himself to imagine what Sarah might say about his four-legged houseguest. She'd always had a way of seeing straight to the heart of things, and he suspected she'd understand why a man who'd sworn off complications had opened his door to a creature whose very presence suggested that the best chapters of his life might still be unwritten. 3 months after bringing Dusty home, Hank stood in his kitchen holding a coffee cup that had grown cold while he watched his companion through the window. The animal had doubled in size since those first fragile weeks, his coat now thick and lustrous, colored in shades of gray and russet that seemed to shift with the desert light. But it wasn't Dusty's growth that unsettled Hank, it was the way he moved. Where most dogs bounded with eager, clumsy enthusiasm, Dusty flowed across the landscape with a fluid grace that spoke of something wilder. His stride was longer, more purposeful, and when he lifted his head to scan the horizon, there was an alertness in his posture that seemed almost ancient. Last night, Hank had been awakened by a sound he'd never heard from any dog. A long, mournful howl that raised the hair on his arms and sent the cattle lowing nervously in the far pasture. The wooden box on his dresser seemed to call to him as he tried to make sense of his growing unease. Inside, Sarah's wedding ring lay nestled in faded blue velvet, the simple gold band catching light from the bedroom window. He'd taken to holding it when uncertainty overwhelmed him, as if her touch might somehow guide him through decisions he wasn't equipped to make alone. The ring was warm from his pocket as he turned it between his fingers, remembering how she'd always known what to do when life presented them with impossible choices. "What would you tell me, darling?" he whispered to the empty room. "What would you say about our unusual house guest?" The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his reverie. Doc Martinez's battered pickup pulled into the yard, but the passenger seat held someone Hank didn't recognize, a small Asian woman in pressed khakis who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously despite her slight stature. "Hank," Doc called as they approached the porch, "brought someone to meet you. This is Dr. Rebecca Chen, the new veterinarian over in Tucson. Thought she might take a look at that dog of yours, make sure he's healthy." Dr. Chen's handshake was firm, her dark eyes intelligent and direct. "Doc tells me you rescued a pup from the desert. I specialize in wildlife rehabilitation, so I'm always interested in successful rescue stories." Hank felt a flutter of anxiety in his chest. "Well, he's doing fine now. Doesn't really need doctoring." "I'm sure he's thriving under your care," Dr. Chen said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But desert rescues can be tricky. Sometimes animals carry diseases or parasites that don't show symptoms right away. A quick examination would give you peace of mind." There was something in her tone that made Hank suspect this visit wasn't as casual as Doc had made it seem, but refusing would only raise more questions, and Dusty did need proper vaccinations if he was going to be around. The cattle. With reluctance, Hank led them toward the mudroom where Dusty spent his afternoons, avoiding the heat. The moment Dr. Chen laid eyes on Dusty, her posture changed. The casual friendliness evaporated, replaced by the focused intensity of a professional. Recognizing something significant, she crouched down, studying Dusty's features with an attention that made Hank's stomach clench. "Beautiful animal," she said carefully. "Very distinctive markings. May I examine him?" Dusty submitted to her touch with surprising docility, as if he sensed her expertise. Dr. Chen's hands moved methodically over his body, checking his teeth, measuring the length of his snout, examining his paws with particular attention. When she looked up at Hank, her expression was grave. "Mr. Barlow, where exactly did you find this animal?" "Near the old mining trail, caught in some barbed wire." "Why?" Dr. Chen straightened, brushing dust from her knees. "The proportions are all wrong for a domestic dog. The elongated snout, the leg-to-body ratio, the size of his paws." She gestured toward Dusty, who was watching their conversation with alert yellow eyes. "This isn't a dog, Mr. Barlow. This is a wolf." The words hit Hank like a physical blow. "That's not possible. He's just a mixed breed, maybe some shepherd in him." "I've been working with wolves for 15 years, Dr. Chen interrupted gently. "Based on his coloring and bone structure, I'd say he's a Mexican gray wolf. They're critically endangered. There are fewer than 200 left in the wild." Doc Martinez let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be damned. That explains the howling I've been hearing at night." Hank's mind raced as the implications crashed. "Over him? What does this mean? Can I keep him?" Dr. Chen's expression grew more serious. "Mexican gray wolves are protected under the Endangered Species Act. Possessing one without federal permits is a felony. I'm legally obligated to report this to Fish and Wildlife Services." "Now hold on," Hank said, his voice rising. "I saved his life. He would have died out there without me." "And you did the right thing," Dr. Chen said. "But wolves aren't pets, Mr. Barlow. They have complex social and territorial needs that can't be met in captivity. This animal belongs in the wild, with his own kind." Hank looked at Dusty, who had moved closer and was now pressed against his leg with the loyalty that had developed over months of careful trust-building. The thought of losing him felt like another death, another piece of his shrinking world being torn away just when he'd begun to hope again. "He's not wild anymore," Hank said quietly. "He's part of my family now." Dr. Chen's voice softened with genuine sympathy. "I understand the bond you've formed, but keeping him is dangerous for both of you. Wolves can become unpredictable as they mature, especially males, and the legal consequences for you could be severe. Federal prison time, substantial fines. What happens if you report this? A team from Fish and Wildlife will come to assess the situation. If Dusty can't be integrated into a wild pack, he'll likely be relocated to a breeding facility or wildlife sanctuary. The goal is always preservation of the species." The wooden box in Hank's pocket seemed to grow heavier as he absorbed this information. Sarah had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it hurt. But what was right in a situation like this? Was it preserving an endangered species, or honoring the bond between two creatures who had saved each other from loneliness? "How long do I have?" Hank asked. "I'm required to file a report within 24 hours, Dr. Chen said. "After that, you'll probably have a few days before officials arrive. I'm sorry, Mr. Barlow. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear." After they left, Hank sat on his porch with Dusty at his feet, watching the sun sink toward the western mountains. The animal's presence had become so natural, so essential to his daily rhythm, that imagining life without him felt like stepping backward into the grey emptiness that had consumed him after Sarah's death. He pulled out his phone and stared at Emma's number, thumb hovering over the call button. She was a smart woman, college-educated, probably knew about laws and regulations, but calling her would mean admitting that he'd been living a lie for months, that the dog he'd mentioned in their brief conversations was actually an endangered species that could land him in federal prison. The thought of losing both Dusty and what remained of his relationship with Emma made his chest tight with panic. But as he looked into those intelligent yellow eyes, Hank realized that some bonds transcended legal definitions. Dusty had chosen him just as surely as he'd chosen Dusty, and that choice meant something that couldn't be dismissed by bureaucrats who'd never understood the particular loneliness of desert living. Sarah's ring was warm against his palm as he made his decision. He had perhaps 48 hours to figure out how to protect the creature who had become his companion, his purpose, and the closest thing to family he had left. Whatever it took, whatever the consequences, Hank Barlow wasn't going to let another piece of his heart be taken away without a fight. The unopened letter sat in Hank's desk drawer like an accusation, its corners softened by 2 years of guilt. And Emma's careful handwriting, growing faint along the edges. He'd found it in his mailbox the morning after one of their worst phone fights, when words had been spoken that couldn't be taken back, and silences had stretched too long. The return address was enough to tell him it contained either forgiveness or goodbye, and he'd never been brave enough to discover which. Now, with Dr. Chen's deadline ticking away, Hank pulled the envelope from beneath old bills and insurance. Papers, turning it over in his weathered hands. Emma's script was precise, controlled, so different from the wild loops and flourishes of her childhood thank-you notes and school reports. This was the handwriting of a woman who'd learned to guard her emotions, and Hank suspected he was largely responsible for that change. Instead of opening it, he set the letter aside and turned to his computer, a machine that Sarah had insisted. They buy years ago, and that had mostly gathered dust since her death. The internet connection was slow but functional, and within an hour he'd learned more about Mexican grey wolves than he'd ever imagined possible. The articles painted a picture of an apex predator nearly extinct, reduced to a remnant population through decades of hunting and habitat loss. The survivors were each genetically precious, their DNA carefully tracked and managed by federal agencies. Wolves in the wild lived in complex family structures, communicated through howls that could carry for miles, and required territories of hundreds of square miles to sustain their natural behaviors. As he read, Hank watched Dusty through the window, noting behaviors he'd previously attributed to unusual intelligence or good breeding. The way Dusty marked specific fence posts with meticulous regularity, his habit of howling at dawn and dusk, always facing different directions, as if sending messages across the desert. The careful way he stalked and caught mice in the barn, dispatching them with swift efficiency that spoke of instincts far older than domestication. "You've been trying to tell me all along, haven't you?" Hank murmured as Dusty appeared at the door, mud on his paws from investigating the stock tank. Over the next few days, Hank began making subtle modifications to his property. He reinforced the chicken coop after finding it torn open, though no chickens were missing. Dusty had apparently been testing its defenses rather than hunting. He installed higher fencing around the garden, remembering Sarah's voice complaining about coyotes. Most importantly, he began extending his evening walks with Dusty, letting the animal set the pace and direction, learning to read the landscape through wolf eyes. The phone rang on Wednesday evening as Hank was preparing dinner. Emma's name on the caller ID made his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. "Hi, Dad?" Her voice carried the cautious warmth she'd developed over years of walking on eggshells around his moods. "Emma, good to hear from you. I was thinking about coming out for Thanksgiving this year, if that's okay with you." The invitation surprised him. They'd spent the last 3 holidays apart, the distance between them measured in more than miles. "Of course it's okay. You're always welcome here. I know things have been difficult between us," she said carefully, "but I've been thinking about Mom a lot lately, and how she always said family was what mattered most." Hank closed his eyes, remembering Sarah's voice saying those exact words during the terrible months after Emma's accident, when his drinking had become a wedge between them. And silence had replaced conversation at the dinner table. The guilt had been overwhelming, his daughter nearly dying while he'd been in town, 3 sheets to the wind and unreachable when she'd needed him most. "Your mother was a wise woman," he said quietly. "She was, and she loved you, Dad, even when you made it hard for her to show it." The words hit him like a gentle punch to the chest. After Sarah's funeral, when Emma had confronted him about his drinking with tears streaming down her face, he'd been too raw and defensive to hear the love beneath her anger. She'd accused him of choosing alcohol over family, and he'd accused her of not understanding what it felt like to lose the person who'd been your anchor for 30 years. They'd both said things that cut deep, and the wounds had never properly healed. "I've been sober for 3 years now," he said, the admission coming easier than he'd expected. "I know, Doc Martinez told me." Of course, Doc had been reporting back. To her, Hank should have realized that Emma would have her ways of keeping track of him, even from a distance. "I got myself a dog," Hank said, surprising himself with the partial truth. "Company, you know, rescued him from the desert." "That's good, Dad. Mom always said you needed something to take care of." After they hung up, Hank sat on his porch watching. Dusty patrolled the perimeter of the yard with methodical precision. The wolf moved like liquid shadow in the gathering dusk, his ears constantly swiveling to catch sounds beyond human perception. When he caught Hank watching, Dusty approached and settled at his feet with a soft exhale that sounded almost like contentment. "We're going to have company for Thanksgiving," Hank told him. "My daughter. You'll like her, I think. She's got her mother's eyes and her mother's heart." Dusty's ears perked at the serious tone, and he lifted his head to study Hank's face with those unnervingly intelligent yellow eyes. The next morning, Miguel Herrera arrived to help with fence repairs on the north pasture. The young ranch hand had been working part-time for Hank since his own family's place had struggled through the drought, and his presence was a welcome reminder that not all of Hank's relationships had to be complicated by history and regret. "Señor, Hank, what kind of tracks are these?" Miguel called from near the stock tank, crouched beside clear impressions in the mud. Hank's stomach clenched as he walked over to examine the paw prints. They were larger than any dog's, with claw marks extending well beyond the toe pads. "Looks like coyote," Hank said with studied casualness. "Probably came down for water." Miguel shook his head, his weathered face skeptical. "My grandfather taught me to read sign when I was 8 years old. These are too big for coyote, too round for mountain lion. Shape is all wrong." Before Hank could respond, Dusty appeared from around the barn, moving with that distinctive flowing gait. Miguel's eyes widened as he took in the animal's size and bearing. "That's some dog, Señor. He's special, all right," Hank agreed, watching as Dusty positioned himself between Miguel and Hank with subtle protective instinct. That evening, as they walked the fence line together, Hank noticed how Dusty's behavior shifted when they encountered the small herd of cattle. Rather than the casual interest of a ranch dog, Dusty displayed the focused attention of a predator assessing prey, but there was restraint in his posture, as if he understood that these animals were under Hank's protection. When a group of coyotes began calling from the distant ridge, Dusty's response was immediate and primal. His howl rose to answer theirs, a sound that seemed to carry messages in a language older than human speech. The coyotes fell silent, and Hank realized that Dusty had just announced his presence to every predator within miles, a declaration that this territory had a new apex guardian. As they walked back toward the house under a canopy of desert stars, Hank found himself thinking about Emma's impending visit and the unopened letter waiting in his desk. Whatever happened with the federal authorities, whatever price he might pay for harboring an endangered species, he was determined that Emma would find him changed when she arrived. The man who'd driven her away with his grief and drinking was gone, replaced by someone who'd learned that second chances were rare gifts not to be wasted on pride or fear. The dust cloud on the horizon appeared 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, unexpected and somehow ominous against the cloudless November sky. Hank set down his coffee and squinted through the kitchen window, recognizing the silver Honda that had once been Sarah's pride and joy. Emma was early, and from the determined way she was driving, this wasn't going to be the careful, scheduled visit they'd planned. Sarah's gardening journal lay open on the kitchen table where Hank had been studying it, its pages filled with her. Careful script and pressed flowers from seasons when the ranch had bloomed with life. Desert lupine and ghost plant, fairy duster and brittlebush, each specimen carefully preserved between sheets of tissue paper, accompanied by notes about soil conditions and watering schedules. The journal had become his refuge during difficult evenings, a tangible connection to the woman who'd believed that anything could grow if you understood its needs and gave it enough patience. Love requires the same attention as gardening, Sarah had written in her careful script beside a pressed desert marigold. You can't force growth, but you can create conditions where it's possible. Dusty materialized beside him at the window, his body tense with alertness as the unfamiliar vehicle approached. Over the past weeks, the wolf had become increasingly protective of their territory, and Hank had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated whether Dusty perceived a threat. Today, his ears were forward but relaxed, his stance curious rather than aggressive, a stranger but not an enemy. Emma's car pulled to a stop in the circular drive that Sarah had lined with native plants, most of which had returned to wild scrubland. In the years since her death, when Emma stepped out, Hank was struck by how much she'd changed since their last visit. Her dark hair was shorter, styled in the efficient cut of a professional woman, and her clothes spoke of success. Pressed slacks and a fitted blazer that looked expensive. But it was her posture that told the real story. The careful way she held herself, as if bracing for disappointment. "Dad?" she called, shading her eyes against the afternoon sun. "I hope it's okay that I came early. I had some vacation time and thought we might—" Her words trailed off as she took in the condition of the property. Hank followed her gaze, seeing the ranch through her eyes for the first time in years. The porch railing Sarah had painted every spring was now weathered grey. Weeds had claimed the flower beds that had once been her mother's pride. The workshop doors hung slightly askew, and the barn needed a new coat of paint. What had felt like peaceful simplicity to Hank must look like neglect to a daughter who remembered this place in its prime. "Hi, sweetheart," Hank said, stepping onto the porch with Dusty at his side. "You're welcome any time, you know that." Emma's attention fixed on Dusty, and Hank held his breath as she studied the animal he described as a rescue dog. At 6 months old, Dusty had reached nearly full size, his grey and russet coat thick for winter, his bearing unmistakably wild despite months of domestication. "This is Dusty," Hank said, his voice carefully neutral. "The one I told you about." "He's beautiful," Emma said, approaching with the caution of someone who'd grown up around animals. "And big. What kind of mix is he?" "Shepherd, maybe some husky," Hank replied, the lie coming easier with practice. "Found him near death out on the trail." Dusty allowed Emma to extend her hand for him to sniff, his yellow eyes studying her face, with an intensity that made Hank nervous. After a moment, the wolf's tail gave a tentative wag, and he stepped closer to accept her touch. "Hello, beautiful boy," Emma murmured, scratching behind his ears. "You're lucky Dad found you." They stood there for a moment, daughter and wolf getting acquainted, while Hank wrestled with the knowledge that everything about this reunion was built on deception. Emma thought she was meeting her father's rescue dog, not an endangered species, that could destroy what remained of their relationship if the truth came out. "The house looks different," Emma said as they walked toward the front door. "Smaller somehow." "Things change when you're living alone," Hank admitted. "Your mother always had projects going, improvements and such. I'm more of a maintenance man." Inside, Emma's inspection was gentle but thorough. She noticed the dust on Sarah's piano, the stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter, the way certain rooms felt abandoned rather than lived in. But she also noticed the dishes washed and put away, the absence of empty bottles that had cluttered the counters during his drinking years, the careful way he'd preserved her mother's garden journal. "You've been reading Mom's notes," she observed, touching the open page with its pressed desert lupine. "Helps me remember her voice," Hank said. "She had opinions about everything, including how to make things grow in this desert." "She had opinions about people too," Emma said softly. "She always said you were like her succulents, capable of surviving anything. But you bloomed better with a little attention." The observation hit closer to home than Hank was comfortable with. "How's David?" he asked, changing the subject to safer ground. Emma's face brightened. "Actually, that's part of why I came early. We set a date." Next October. I wanted to ask if you'd walk me down the aisle. The request caught Hank off guard, emotion tightening his throat. After years of careful distance, the idea that Emma still wanted him in that role felt like undeserved grace. I'd be honored, he said simply. David's a good man, Dad. You'll like him. He's patient and kind, and he makes me laugh. Mom would have approved. Then I approved too. That evening, they sat on the porch as they had during Emma's childhood, watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of gold and crimson. Dusty lay between them, his presence somehow making conversation easier than it had been in years. I've missed this, Emma said, gesturing toward the vast landscape. The quiet. In Phoenix, there's always noise, traffic, construction, people. Sometimes I forget how peaceful it can be out here. Peaceful's one word for it, Hank said. Your mother used to say it was like living inside a prayer. She was right. There's something about this place. Emma stopped as Dusty suddenly lifted, his head, ears swiveling toward the distant ridges. A moment later, the evening silence was broken by his howl, long and mournful and unlike anything Emma had ever heard from a domestic dog. What was that? She asked, startled. He does that sometimes, Hank said, his heart hammering. Talks to the coyotes, I guess. Desert dogs are different from city ones. Emma watched as Dusty's howl was answered by distant voices from the hills. Not coyotes, but something deeper, more resonant. The sound raised goosebumps on her arms and made the vast desert feel suddenly less empty. It's beautiful, she said softly. Haunting. Your mother would have loved him, Hank said. And for the first time in years, that wasn't a painful thought. Sarah had always been drawn to wild things, understanding that some creatures needed freedom more than comfort. If she were here now, she'd probably see straight through to Dusty's true nature and find a way to protect both the wolf and the man who'd claimed him as family. As the stars emerged overhead and the desert settled into its nocturnal rhythms, Hank allowed himself to hope that maybe, with Emma here and Dusty at his side, he might finally create the conditions where love could grow again, even if that love was built on secrets he wasn't yet brave enough to share. The rusty cattle brand hung on the workshop wall like a piece of family scripture, its iron letters spelling out Circle B in the flowing script that Hank's grandfather had designed nearly a century ago. 3 generations of Barlow men had heated that brand in forge fires and pressed it into the flanks of cattle, marking ownership in the ancient way of ranchers who understood that some claims transcended legal documents. Now, as Hank gripped the worn handle in his weathered hands, he wondered if the legacy it represented was strong enough to protect what mattered most. The black SUVs appeared on Monday morning like storm clouds, gathering on a clear horizon. 2 vehicles with government plates and tinted windows, moving with the purposeful efficiency of federal authority. Emma was in the kitchen making coffee when Hank spotted them from the workshop, and his first instinct was to warn her somehow, to prepare her for what was coming. But there was no time, and perhaps it was better that her surprise would be genuine. Agent Patricia Winters stepped from the lead vehicle with the bearing of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. Mid-40s, grey-streaked hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, hiking boots that had seen real use. Her partner, Agent Tom Bradley, was younger and softer around the edges, with the eager attention of someone still proving himself in a job that demanded both expertise and patience. Mr. Barlow? Agent Winters approached with a badge that caught the morning light. I'm Agent Winters with Fish and Wildlife Services, and this is Agent Bradley. We'd like to speak with you about a possible wildlife incident on your property. Hank's mouth went dry, but he kept his voice steady. What kind of incident? We received a report about a possible Mexican gray wolf sighting in this area. As you probably know, they're critically endangered and protected under federal law. We're conducting routine interviews with local landowners. Emma appeared on the porch, drawn by voices and the sight of official vehicles. Dusty materialized beside her, and Hank's heart stopped as the wolf positioned himself between Emma and the strangers with subtle protective instinct. "Good morning," Emma called, her lawyer's training evident in the way she assessed the situation. "Is everything all right? Your daughter?" Agent Winters asked. "Yes, Emma Barlow. She's visiting for the holidays." Agent Bradley's attention fixed on Dusty with professional interest. "Beautiful dog. What breed?" "Rescue mix," Emma answered before Hank could speak. "Dad found him half dead in the desert. Aren't you lucky, Dusty?" At the sound of his name, Dusty's tail wagged, and he trotted down the steps to investigate the newcomers. Agent Bradley extended his hand for the wolf to sniff, and Hank held his breath as two federal agents examined an endangered species they believed to be a domestic dog. "Shepherd mix?" Agent Winters asked, running her hand along Dusty's flank. "That's what the vet thinks," Hank said, the lie burning his throat. "Some husky, maybe." "He's been such a blessing for Dad," Emma added, her voice warm with genuine affection. "Having company has made such a difference in his mood. He was pretty isolated after Mom died." Agent Winters nodded sympathetically. "Grief can be overwhelming. Animals often provide comfort when people can't." Hank watched the agents examine Dusty, noting how Agent Bradley's trained eye lingered on certain features. The elongated snout, the size of the paws, the alert intelligence in those yellow eyes. But Emma's presence seemed to deflect suspicion, her obvious love for what she believed was her father's rescue dog, creating a narrative that felt domestic and safe. "We'd like to walk your property lines if you don't mind," Agent Winters said. "Look for tracks, scat, den sites, any evidence of wolf activity." "Of course," Hank agreed, though his heart was hammering. "Though I haven't seen anything unusual. Coyotes, mostly. Some javelinas near the water tanks. They spent the morning walking fence lines and examining game trails. Agent Bradley documenting everything with a digital camera, while Agent Winters questioned Hank about wildlife sightings. Emma insisted on accompanying them, playing the role of protective daughter while unknowingly helping to maintain the deception. "Dad's been ranching this land for 30 years, she told the agents as they examined tracks near the stock tank. "He knows every animal that comes through here. If there was a wolf, he'd have reported it. Responsible citizens like your father are crucial to conservation efforts." Agent Winters agreed. "Mexican gray wolves need human allies if they're going to survive." The irony was lost on no one except the agents themselves. Hank was indeed a crucial ally to Mexican gray wolf survival, just not in the way they imagined. Near the old mining trail, where Hank had found Dusty, Agent Bradley discovered something that made him crouch for a closer look. "Patricia, check this out." Hank's blood ran cold as the younger agent pointed to a clear paw print in the dried mud. Too large for a coyote, too canine for a mountain lion. Agent Winters studied the track with professional attention, measuring it with a small ruler and photographing it from multiple angles. "This is fresh," she said, "within the last week." "Could it be from a large dog?" Emma asked innocently. "Possible," Agent Winters said, though her tone suggested doubt. "We've had reports of wolves dispersing from the release sites in New Mexico, young males looking for territory and mates. They continued their search for another hour, finding scattered evidence that could be interpreted multiple ways. Scat that might belong to a large dog or a small wolf. Scratches on trees that could indicate territorial marking. Disturbances in the underbrush that suggested the passage of something substantial. We'd like to set up some trail cameras, Agent Bradley said as they concluded their survey. Motion-activated wireless transmission. They won't interfere with your operations, but they'll help us monitor wildlife activity. Hank's mouth went dry. How long would they stay up? Standard monitoring period is 30 days, Agent Winters explained. If we don't capture evidence of wolf activity by then, we'll remove them and close the investigation. After the agents left, Hank and Emma sat on the porch with Dusty between them, watching the government vehicles disappear into desert shimmer. Emma was quiet for a long time, absently scratching behind the wolf's ears while she processed what had just occurred. "Dad," she said finally, "that dog of yours, Dusty, there's something different about him, isn't there?" Hank's chest tightened. What do you mean? The way he moves, the way he watches everything. The sound he makes at night. I've been around. Ranch dogs my whole life, and he's not like any of them. For a moment, Hank considered telling her the truth, laying out the whole impossible situation and trusting her to understand why he'd made the choices he had. But the weight of potential consequences held him back. Emma had a career, a reputation, a future with David that could all be jeopardized by association with federal wildlife crimes. He's special, Hank said carefully. Been through a lot before. I found him. Sometimes trauma changes an animal, makes them more aware, more careful. Emma nodded, but something in her expression suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. Those agents seem professional, competent. If there really is a wolf out here, they'll find it. I suppose they will, Hank agreed, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the cattle brand in his pocket, the small piece of family iron he'd taken to carrying as a talisman. His grandfather had built this ranch with nothing but determination and the understanding that some things were worth fighting for. His father had expanded it through drought and recession, never backing down from challenges that would have broken lesser men. Now it was Hank's turn to prove himself worthy of the Circle B legacy, to protect something precious even if it meant standing against the very government that claimed to share his goals. The brand was warm against his palm, and he drew strength from its weight, from the knowledge that 3 generations of Barlow's stubbornness ran in his veins. 30 days. That's how long he had to figure out how to save both Dusty and himself from the consequences of love that transcended law. The dream catcher hung in Sarah's old sewing room, its intricate web of sinew and beads casting delicate shadows on the wall where afternoon light filtered through dusty windows. A tribal elder named Joseph Crowfeather had given it to her years ago when she'd helped his granddaughter through a difficult birth. Payment offered in the traditional way when money couldn't adequately express gratitude. Sarah had treasured it not for its beauty, but for what it represented, the connection between all living things and the responsibility that came with being chosen to protect something sacred. Emma found Hank there on Thursday morning, 3 days after the agent's visit, sitting in Sarah's rocking chair and staring at the dream catcher as if it might offer answers to questions he couldn't voice. Dusty lay at his feet, equally still, both man and wolf seeming to understand that their time together was running out in ways that measured more than days. "Dad," Emma said softly, settling onto the window seat where her mother had spent countless hours mending clothes and planning gardens. "We need to talk." Hank didn't look away from the dreamcatcher. "About what?" "About Dusty. About the fact that he's not what you've been telling people he is." The accusation hung in the air between them like a challenge. Hank's hands stilled on the wolf's head, and Emma could see the war playing out behind his eyes, the desire to continue the deception, battling against exhaustion, with carrying such a significant secret alone. "I don't know what you mean," he said finally, but his voice lacked conviction. "Dad, I'm not an idiot. I've spent the last 3 days watching him, really watching. The way he hunts mice in the barn, that's not play. That's predatory instinct. His tracks are too big, his howl is too wild, and his eyes—" She gestured toward Dusty, who was studying their conversation with unsettling intelligence. "Those aren't dog eyes." Hank was quiet for so long that Emma began to wonder if he would respond at all. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "He's a Mexican gray wolf." The admission seemed to deflate him, as if keeping the secret had required physical strength he could no longer maintain. Emma felt a mixture of vindication and terror wash over her. Vindication at having her suspicions confirmed, terror at the implications of what her father had just confessed. "Jesus, Dad, do you have any idea what you've done? What kind of legal trouble you're in?" "I know exactly what I've done," Hank said, his voice gaining strength. "I saved a dying animal that nobody else would have bothered with. I gave him a home when the alternative was death. And now the federal government is looking for him. Emma's voice rose with panic. Those agents yesterday, they weren't here by coincidence. Someone reported a wolf sighting, and when they find out you've been harboring an endangered species, they won't find out. How can you possibly believe that? They're setting up cameras, Dad. Trail cameras that will capture every movement on this property. The moment Dusty steps in front of one of them, it's over. Hank finally looked at her, and Emma was startled by the depth of pain in his eyes. I can't lose him, Emma. I know how that sounds. I know it's not rational, but I can't. He struggled for words. He's what pulled me back from the edge after your mother died, when I was drinking myself to death and pushing away everyone who cared about me. He gave me a reason to get up in the morning, and I understand that. I do. But keeping him is destroying any chance you have of a knock at the front door interrupted their argument. Through the window, Emma could see an elderly Native American man standing on the porch, his weathered face patient but serious. Dusty's ears perked up, and he moved to the window with interest rather than alarm. That's Joseph Crow Feather, Hank said, relief evident in his voice. He might have some answers. Joseph's presence filled the room with a kind of calm authority that Emma associated with people who'd spent their lives listening to the wisdom of elders. His grey hair was braided with leather and beads, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who still worked with traditional tools. I've been watching the government men, he said without preamble, settling into the chair Hank offered. They're looking for the wrong thing in the wrong way. What do you mean? Emma asked. Wolves aren't possessions to be owned or lost. They're spirits that choose their own families. Joseph's eyes moved to Dusty, who approached with cautious respect. This one chose well. The law doesn't see it that way, Emma said. The law says, my father is committing a federal crime. The law is written by people who've forgotten that we don't own the earth. We're part of it. Joseph extended his hand to Dusty, who sniffed briefly before allowing the touch. In our tradition, when a wild spirit chooses to live with humans, it's because both have something to learn from each other. What if the agents find him? Hank asked. Then they'll take him to a place where he'll be safe but not free, alive but not truly living. Is that what you want for him? The question hung heavy in the afternoon air. Emma watched her father wrestle with an impossible choice. Keeping Dusty meant risking his own freedom, but letting him go meant breaking a bond that had literally saved his life. There might be another way, Joseph said quietly, but it would require trust in something larger than human law. Before he could explain, the sky outside darkened with the sudden violence of a desert storm. Rain began hammering the roof with surprising intensity, and lightning split the air with electric fury. Dusty grew agitated, pacing to the window and back, his primitive instincts responding to atmospheric pressure, changes that humans couldn't detect. He needs to run, Joseph observed. Storm energy calls to the wolf spirit. As if responding to the elder's words, Dusty moved to the door and whined, a sound they'd never heard from him before, plaintive and urgent. When Hank opened the door, the wolf bolted into the storm without hesitation, disappearing into the curtain of rain and wind. Dusty! Emma called, but he was already gone, claimed by forces older than domestication. For 2 days, they searched. Hank walked the fence lines, calling Dusty's name, while Emma drove the ranch roads in her car, windows down, despite the continuing drizzle. Miguel joined the search on horseback, covering ground that vehicles couldn't reach. Even Doc Martinez helped, using his knowledge of wildlife patterns to suggest places a confused animal might seek shelter. Word of the missing dog spread through the sparse ranching community. Neighbors who rarely spoke called to offer help or report possible sightings. Mrs. Henderson from the next ranch over mentioned seeing something large and gray near her chicken coop. The feed store owner in town asked if Hank wanted to post a reward notice on their bulletin board, but it was Miguel who voiced what everyone was thinking as they gathered in Hank's kitchen on the second evening, exhausted and empty-handed. Senor, Hank, forgive me, but that animal, He moves like no dog I've ever seen. My grandfather would say he has the spirit of something that belongs to the wind." Emma saw understanding dawn in the faces around the table. These were people who'd lived close to the land all their lives, who understood the difference between domestic and wild. Their willingness to help search had been motivated by loyalty to Hank, but their silence afterward would depend on their judgment of what they'd really been looking for. That night, as rain continued to whisper against the windows, Emma sat beside her father on the porch, where they'd once shared easy conversations about ordinary things. The silence between them now was full of questions that had no good answers. "He'll come back," Hank said finally. "He's not a dog, but he's not entirely wild anymore either. We're his pack now. And if he doesn't, then maybe that's his choice to make." Emma looked at her father's profile in the darkness, seeing something she'd never noticed before, a willingness to accept loss if it meant honoring love. It was a kind of strength she wasn't sure she possessed, and it made her wonder if the isolation she'd attributed to grief was actually a deeper form of wisdom about the nature of attachment and letting go. The DNA test results arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in the clinical language of genetic analysis, but their implications hit Hank like a physical blow. Dr. Chen's covering letter was brief and urgent. "Call me immediately. This changes everything." The scientific data that followed read like a death sentence disguised as a miracle. Dusty wasn't just any Mexican gray wolf. He was genetically priceless, carrying bloodlines that scientists had thought extinct for decades. Hank found Dusty at dawn on the third day, limping along the fence line, with his left rear leg dragging and dried blood matted in his fur. The wolf had returned as silently as he'd left, materializing from the desert morning like a ghost made flesh. But the proud carriage was gone, replaced by the careful movements of an animal fighting pain and exhaustion. "Easy, boy," Hank murmured, approaching slowly with hands extended. Dusty's yellow eyes held a wariness that hadn't been there before, as if his time in the wild had reminded him that humans weren't always the sanctuary they pretended to be. The wounds were clean but deep. Bullet grazes along his flank and a puncture wound in his leg that spoke of buckshot fired at close range. Someone had tried to kill him, and from the defensive patterns of the injuries, Dusty had been running when it happened. "Emma!" Hank called toward the house. "I need you to call Dr. Chen. Tell her it's an emergency." Dr. Chen arrived within an hour, her veterinary bag supplemented by equipment that Hank didn't recognize: digital cameras, sample containers, and what looked suspiciously like genetic testing materials. Her examination was thorough and grim, but it was the conversation that followed that turned Hank's world upside down. "The blood samples I took during his initial examination," she said as she cleaned Dusty's wounds. "I sent them for genetic analysis as part of a research project on desert canids. The results came back yesterday." She handed Hank a folder, thick with laboratory printouts and official letterhead. "Dusty isn't just a Mexican gray wolf, Mr. Barlow. According to the genetic markers, he's from the Lobos ancestrales line, the last pure bloodline of the original Mexican gray wolves. Scientists thought that genetic heritage was extinct." Emma leaned over Hank's shoulder to read the report, her lawyer's training helping her parse the technical language. "It says here that his genetic value for breeding purposes is—" She stopped, staring at the number. "This can't be right." "It's right," Dr. Chen confirmed grimly. "In conservation terms, Dusty is worth more than most people's houses. His genetic material could restore diversity to the entire Mexican gray wolf population." "What does that mean for us?" Hank asked, though he suspected he already knew. "It means the federal government will move heaven and earth to get him. But it also means other interests will be involved. Biotech companies, private research facilities, international conservation organizations. This isn't just about wildlife law anymore, Mr. Barlow. This is about genetics worth millions of dollars." The phone rang, as if summoned by her words. Emma answered with the cautious tone she'd developed. over the past few days, but her expression quickly shifted from wariness to confusion to something approaching betrayal. "David," she said, "how did you— Yes, I'm at Dad's ranch, but how did you know—" She listened for a long moment, her face growing pale. "I think you need to explain that again." Hank watched his daughter's world reshape itself in real time, as David's voice carried clearly through the phone, professional and apologetic in equal measure. Emma's fiancé wasn't calling as a concerned partner. He was calling as an agent of the federal government, and the conversation that followed revealed layers of deception that made Hank's secret-keeping seem almost innocent by comparison. "You've been working with Fish and Wildlife Services for how long?" Emma's voice cracked with disbelief. 6 months? Since before we got engaged? The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. David's sudden interest in Emma's family history, his casual questions about her father's property, his encouragement for her to visit the ranch more often. Even their relationship, built on what Emma had believed was genuine attraction and compatibility, had been orchestrated as an intelligence-gathering operation. "The anonymous tip that brought the federal agents to the ranch," Emma said, her voice growing colder with each word. "That was you, wasn't it?" Hank felt rage building in his chest, not just at the betrayal of his daughter, but at the calculated manipulation that had turned family bonds into weapons of surveillance. David had used Emma's love against her father, and the violation felt worse than any legal threat. "No, Emma, don't hang up," David's voice carried from the phone. "You need to understand the situation. The wolf your father is harboring isn't just endangered, it's genetically invaluable. We're talking about the potential salvation of an entire species. By lying to me? By using our relationship as cover for spying on my family?" The operation was already in motion when we met, but Emma, my feelings for you are real. The assignment may have brought us together, but everything that happened between us after that was genuine. Emma's laugh was bitter. "How convenient that your genuine feelings aligned so perfectly with your professional objectives." Dr. Chen quietly continued her work on Dusty's wounds while the family drama unfolded, but Hank could see her taking notes, observations that would undoubtedly find their way into official reports. The clinical detachment with which she documented Dusty's injuries suddenly felt ominous, as if she were building a case rather than simply treating a patient. "There's something else," Dr. Chen said when Emma finally hung up. "The pattern of these bullet wounds, they're not from hunters or ranchers defending livestock. These are small caliber rounds fired from multiple angles. Someone was trying to capture, not kill." "Capture for what?" Hank asked. "The same genetic material that makes Dusty valuable to conservation efforts makes him valuable to private interests. There are people who would pay enormous sums for access to his DNA, and not all of them are motivated by species preservation." The implication hit Hank like cold water. Illegal poachers hadn't been trying to kill Dusty. They'd been trying to tranquilize him for sale to the highest bidder. "The wolf had escaped an attempted kidnapping, not a hunting incident. We have to assume his location is compromised," Dr. Chen continued. "If poachers found him once, they'll find him again. And now that his genetic value is documented," she gestured toward the DNA results, "the stakes are too high for anyone to simply walk away." Emma stared at her phone as if it had personally betrayed her. "David said the federal task force is mobilizing. They'll be here tomorrow with a full team. Agents, geneticists, wildlife specialists. And he said something about corporate representatives." "What kind of corporate representatives?" Hank asked. "Biogenesis Corporation. Apparently, they've been lobbying for access to endangered species genetic material for research purposes. David said they're prepared to offer significant compensation to the government and to—" She looked at her father with something approaching horror. "To you, Dad. They want to buy him." The idea of Dusty being reduced to a commodity, his life and freedom measured in dollars and genetic potential, made Hank's stomach turn. But it was the recognition that everyone, federal agents, corporate interests, even his own daughter's fiancé, had been playing a longer game than he'd realized. That truly shook him. "They've been watching us," he said quietly, All of us. This whole time. It looks that way, Dr. Chen agreed. The question now is what you're going to do about it. Outside, Dusty lay in the afternoon shade, his wounds cleaned and bandaged, but his spirit clearly diminished by whatever he'd experienced during his time away. The proud, confident animal who'd bonded with Hank over months of trust-building had been replaced by a creature that understood, perhaps for the first time, that the human world could be as dangerous as any natural predator. Emma sat beside her. Farther on the porch steps, both of them watching the wolf who had become the center of forces larger than any of them had imagined. The comfortable deceptions that had sustained their reunion were gone, replaced by the hard knowledge that their choices in the next 24 hours would determine not just Dusty's fate, but the future of their own relationship and possibly their freedom. "Dad," Emma said finally, "I need you to know that whatever David's original motives were, whatever games the federal government has been playing, I'm on your side. Whatever you decide to do, whatever it costs, I'm with you." The words carried the weight of a daughter choosing her father over her future, family loyalty over legal safety. And as Hank looked into Emma's eyes, Sarah's eyes, he saw the kind of courage that had built the Barlow legacy, the willingness to stand against impossible odds when something precious was at stake. The DNA results rustled in the desert wind, their scientific certainty mocking the uncertainty of everything else. Tomorrow, the full weight of federal authority would descend on the ranch, backed by corporate money and legal power that could crush an aging cowboy and his wounded wolf without a second thought. But tonight, for the first time in years, Hank. Barlow wasn't facing the future alone. Sarah's brass compass lay warm in Hank's palm as he crouched beside Dusty in the pre-dawn darkness, the needle pointing steadily north toward the Apache reservation lands that stretched beyond the horizon. Like a promise of sanctuary, the antique instrument had belonged to Sarah's grandfather, a surveyor who'd mapped mining claims across the Southwest during the territorial days, and she'd carried it on every hiking trip they'd taken together during their 30 years of marriage. Now, as federal agents slept in the motel 30 miles away, preparing for a dawn raid that would end his freedom, Hank trusted the compass to guide him toward one last desperate gamble. "We're going to disappear for a while," he whispered to Dusty, whose yellow eyes reflected starlight with predatory alertness. The wolf's wounds had healed enough for travel, though he still favored his left rear leg. "Just you and me, like it should have been from the beginning." They'd left the ranch at midnight, Hank carrying only essential supplies, in a pack that Sarah had used for their wilderness camping trips. Water, jerky, basic medical supplies, and the compass that had never led them astray. Behind them, the house sat dark and empty, though Hank suspected it wouldn't remain that way for long. The terrain grew rougher as they moved away from ranch roads and into country that hadn't changed since Apache warriors had used these same trails to evade cavalry patrols. Dusty seemed to understand that stealth was paramount, his paws finding silent purchase on rocks and sand, while Hank struggled to match the wolf's natural grace. They were both wounded, Dusty physically, Hank emotionally, but they moved with shared purpose through landscape that offered concealment to those who understood its secrets. By dawn, they'd covered 8 miles and reached the first of the water sources that Hank remembered from his younger days when hunting and fishing had taken him deep into wilderness that most people never saw. A hidden spring fed a small pool surrounded by cottonwoods, the kind of place where Apache families had camped for generations before European settlement changed the rules of survival. Hank allowed himself to rest, while Dusty drank deeply and explored scents that spoke of other wildlife, deer, javelina, coyotes that had passed this way recently. The wolf's demeanor began to change as they moved deeper into country where his instincts were assets rather than liabilities. His posture straightened, his movements became more confident, and the wariness that had marked him since his encounter with poachers began to fade. "This is what you needed, isn't it?" Hank murmured, watching Dusty test the wind with nostrils that could detect information invisible to human senses. Room to be what you really are. The sound of helicopters reached them before noon, distant but unmistakable, the rhythmic beating of rotors that meant the manhunt had begun. Hank checked the compass and led them deeper into a maze of arroyos and boulder fields where aircraft couldn't land, and tracking would be difficult even for experts. But he knew they were only buying time. The resources arrayed against them included thermal imaging, canine units, and personnel who made pursuit their profession. Emma's voice reached him through the satellite phone he'd almost left behind, her words crackling with static and emotion. "Dad, where are you?" The federal task force arrived this morning with enough firepower to invade a small country. David's here, looking like someone shot his dog. They've got search teams, helicopters, and something called a genetic recovery specialist who talks about Dusty like he's a museum exhibit. "Are you all right?" Hank asked, though he could hear the strain in her voice. "I'm furious, if that counts as all right. Furious at David for lying to me, furious at myself for falling for it, and furious at the whole system that thinks an animal's value can be measured in dollars and breeding potential." Her voice cracked slightly. "Dad, they're treating this like a terrorist incident. They've got roadblocks, aerial surveillance, and they're talking about bringing in tracking dogs. They won't find us," Hank said with more confidence than he felt. "Maybe not right away, but you can't run forever. And Dad, there's something else. Joseph Crowfeather was here an hour ago. He said he needed to speak with you, that there were people who might help, but time was running out." After she hung up, Hank studied the compass needle and made a decision that would have terrified him a week ago. The Apache Reservation was sovereign territory where federal jurisdiction became complicated, and if Joseph had resources willing to help, it was worth the risk of exposure. They moved through the afternoon heat, following game trails that paralleled the reservation boundary. Dusty's hunting instincts were fully engaged now, his attention shifting constantly between potential prey and potential threats. When a jackrabbit bolted from cover, the wolf's pursuit was swift and lethal, providing them both with fresh meat that Hank cooked over a fire so small it barely qualified as flame. "You're teaching me things I forgot I knew," Hank admitted as they shared the meal. "Been so long since I had to live off the land, I'd almost convinced myself I couldn't do it anymore." The helicopter sounds had grown more distant as the day progressed, but Hank knew the searchers were establishing a perimeter, cordoning off escape routes, and forcing him toward terrain where capture would be inevitable. The chess game was entering its final phases, and his opponents had resources he couldn't match. Joseph Crowfeather appeared as the sun was setting, materializing from rocks and shadow, with the silent approach that marked men who'd learned hunting, skills from grandfathers, who remembered when stealth meant survival. With him came two younger men whose presence radiated competence and caution. "They're calling you an eco-terrorist on the news," Joseph said without preamble. "Federal fugitive harboring stolen genetic material worth millions of dollars." "That's one way to look at it," Hank replied. "Our way is different. We see a man protecting a brother who chose him as family." Joseph's weathered hand gestured toward Dusty, who watched the newcomers with alert but unalarmed attention. "The old stories tell us that wolves and humans were partners before governments taught us to be enemies," one of the younger men introduced. As Thomas, Joseph's grandson, and a lawyer specializing in tribal sovereignty issues, spread a map on the ground between them. "The reservation boundary is 2 miles north of here. Once you cross onto tribal land, federal jurisdiction becomes contested territory. We can't stop them from pursuing, but we can slow them down with legal challenges while other options are explored." "What other options?" Hank asked. "There are people who believe that genetic diversity shouldn't be owned by corporations or governments," the third man said. His name was Carlos, and something in his manner suggested military training. "Networks that help preserve endangered species outside official channels. They're prepared to offer sanctuary to both of you, but it would mean leaving the country." The proposition hung heavy in the desert air. Exile in exchange for freedom, surrender of everything familiar in order to protect what had become most precious. Hank thought of the ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations, of Emma's upcoming wedding, of the life he'd built through decades of patient accumulation. "How long do I have to decide?" he asked. "Not long," Thomas said, checking his watch. "Federal forces are planning a dawn sweep of this entire area. They've got thermal imaging and tracking teams that will be hard to evade in daylight." As if summoned by his words, Emma's voice called from the darkness beyond their small camp. She emerged from the boulder field, her city clothes torn by thorns, and her face streaked with exhaustion, but her eyes blazing with determination that reminded Hank powerfully of her mother. "I've been tracking you for 6 hours," she said, settling beside the fire without invitation. "Following water sources and reading sign the way you taught me when I was 12. "Emma, you shouldn't be here," Hank protested. "If the federal teams find you with us, let me worry about my own legal exposure," she interrupted. "I'm here because I figured out something important while I was hiking through the desert following wolf tracks and boot prints." She looked around the circle of faces, her gaze lingering on Dusty, who had moved closer to her with the same protective instinct he'd shown toward Hank. "David was right about one thing," she continued. "This isn't really about wildlife law or even genetic preservation. It's about control. Who gets to decide what happens to something valuable? Who profits from it? Who has the authority to define its future? And," Joseph prompted, "and I think there's a 4th option nobody's considered. What if Dusty gets to choose for himself?" The suggestion seemed simple, almost naive, but something in the way she said it made the men around the fire lean forward with attention. "Wolves choose their own packs," Emma continued. "They choose their own territory, their own mates, their own lives. Everyone's been treating Dusty like he's property to be allocated, but what if we let him decide where he belongs?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Tribal law recognizes animal autonomy in ways that federal law doesn't. If Dusty chooses to stay with your father, that choice carries legal weight on reservation land. But only if we can get them to the reservation," Carlos added, "and only if the choice is made publicly, with witnesses who can testify to its authenticity." Hank looked at the compass in his hand, its needle pointing steadily north toward lands where different rules applied and different forms of justice might be possible. Around him, people who barely knew him were preparing to risk their own safety for a principle that transcended law. The idea that some bonds were sacred, regardless of what governments decreed. "If we do this," he said quietly, "there's no going back. Whatever happens, Emma, your life will be changed forever." "My life was already changed," she replied, reaching out to scratch behind Dusty's ears. "The moment I realized that some things are worth fighting for, even when the odds are impossible." The compass was warm in Hank's palm as he made his decision, its brass surface reflecting firelight that danced like hope against the desert darkness. Tomorrow would bring federal forces and corporate interests and the full weight of institutional power. But tonight, in a hidden camp where ancient laws still held meaning, a different kind of justice was being born. Dawn broke over the ancient cave where Hank and Dusty had sheltered through the night, revealing walls covered in petroglyphs that spoke of connections between humans and wolves, stretching back thousands of years. Among the painted symbols, a fossilized paw print pressed into stone caught the morning light, evidence of some long-dead wolf who had once walked this exact ground, leaving behind proof that this bond transcended the brief history of governments and laws. Hank traced the fossilized print with his fingertip, marveling at how perfectly Dusty's paw matched the ancient impression. The wolf lay beside him, alert but calm, as if he too understood that they had reached a place where time folded back on itself, and the oldest truths still held power. The sound of vehicles approaching shattered the morning stillness. Through the cave mouth, Hank could see black SUVs taking positions along the ridge, their occupants deploying with military precision. Agent Winter's voice carried across the desert air, amplified by electronic equipment that turned her words into commands, echoing off canyon walls. Mr. Barlow, this is Agent Patricia Winters with Fish and Wildlife Services. You're surrounded by federal agents, and we need you to come out of the cave with your hands visible. Hank checked the rifle he'd brought from the ranch, his grandfather's Winchester, loaded but not chambered. He had no intention of shooting anyone, but 30 years of ranching had taught him that predators respected strength more than vulnerability. "I'm armed, but I don't want trouble," Hank called back. "I just want to talk. We're not here to hurt. You were the wolf, Mr. Barlow, but harboring an endangered species is a federal crime, and we need to resolve this situation peacefully." Dusty moved to the cave mouth, positioning himself between Hank and the agents, with protective instinct that had nothing to do with training. His yellow eyes surveyed the tactical formation arrayed against them, dozens of armed professionals, whose body language spoke of preparation for violence, despite their peaceful words. Emma's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Dad, I'm coming up. Don't shoot anyone until I get there." She appeared on the trail below the cave, hands raised, but moving with purpose toward the standoff. Behind her, David followed at a careful distance, his face pale with what looked like genuine anguish. Joseph Crow Feather and his grandson Thomas flanked them, their presence adding another dimension to an already complex confrontation. "Emma, stay back," Agent Winters called. "This situation is dangerous." "The only danger here is miscommunication," Emma replied, continuing her climb toward the cave. "My father isn't a terrorist or a criminal. He's a grieving man who formed a bond with an animal that saved his life." Agent Winters emerged from behind her vehicle, weapon holstered but ready, her professional demeanor masking something that looked like personal conflict. "Miss Barlow, your father is in possession of genetic material worth millions of dollars to conservation efforts. This isn't about sentiment. It's about species survival." "And what about his survival?" Emma reached the cave mouth, positioning herself between the agents and her father. "What about the survival of bonds that transcend monetary value?" From his position in the shadows, Hank could see the media circus assembling on the perimeter. News trucks with satellite dishes, reporters, speaking into cameras, and what looked suspiciously like corporate representatives in expensive suits. The story had become national news, and the resolution would be watched by millions. "Agent Winters," Thomas called from the slope below, his voice carrying legal authority. "You're on the border of sovereign tribal territory. Any action you take here falls under contested jurisdiction." "I'm aware of the complications," Winters replied, though something in her tone suggested frustration with those complications. "But federal law supersedes tribal sovereignty when it comes to endangered species protection." David stepped forward, his movement drawing Dusty's immediate attention. The wolf's hackles rose slightly, sensing threat in the man who had betrayed his pack. "Mr. Barlow," David called, his voice strained with emotion. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but I need you to understand something. This operation, it wasn't supposed to happen this way." "David, shut up," Agent Winters warned, but he continued. "The original plan was to verify the wolf's presence and arrange voluntary surrender with full compensation and visitation rights. But once the genetic tests came back, showing his breeding value, corporate interests got involved, and everything changed." "What kind of corporate interests?" Emma demanded. Agent Winters looked like she wanted to silence David, but something in her expression suggested she was struggling with her own conscience. "Biogenesis Corporation has lobbied the Department of Interior for access to endangered species genetic material. They've offered substantial funding for conservation programs in exchange for breeding rights." "So this isn't about conservation," Hank said, stepping into the light, with his rifle held low but ready. "It's about profit." "It's about both," Winters replied, but her voice lacked conviction. "Conservation requires funding, and genetic diversity requires breeding programs." Dusty moved closer to Hank, pressing against his leg with the same loyalty he'd shown since those first desperate days of recovery. The wolf's presence seemed to remind everyone that this wasn't an abstract debate about policy. This was about a living creature whose choices and bonds meant nothing to the systems that claimed to protect him. "Agent Winters," Joseph called from below, "in our tradition, when a wild spirit chooses to live with humans, that choice must be honored. The law that matters here is older than your government. Mr. Crow-Feather, I respect your traditions, but I have federal obligations. What obligations do you have to your own father?" The question came from Emma, whose lawyer's instincts had apparently detected something in the agent's demeanor. "Because you've been looking at my dad like you understand exactly what he's going through." Agent Winters was quiet for a long moment, her professional mask slipping to reveal something raw and personal beneath. When she spoke again, her voice was softer, more human. "My father was a Vietnam veteran who came home broken and angry and isolated. After my mother left, he lived alone on 40 acres in Montana, getting more bitter and paranoid every year. I tried to help, tried to get him into programs, tried to bridge the gap between us." She paused, looking directly at Hank. "He died alone, Mr. Barlow. Died alone because I chose federal obligations over family ones, because I believed the system knew better than the heart." The admission hung in the desert air like a confession, changing the entire dynamic of the confrontation. This wasn't just about federal authority versus individual freedom. It was about agents and citizens who had all lost pieces of themselves to systems that reduced love to policy and bonds to legal categories. "What if there was another way?" Agent Winters asked, her voice barely carrying across the distance. "What if we could find a solution that honored both federal law and family bonds?" The fossilized paw print seemed to pulse with ancient wisdom. As Hank considered the possibility that enemies might become allies when they recognized their shared humanity. Around them, the desert waited with the patience of geological time, while in the cave mouth, man and wolf prepared to discover whether justice could be larger than law. The handwritten agreement took shape on pages torn from Emma's legal pad, each clause crafted through hours of negotiation between federal agents, tribal representatives, corporate lawyers, and one stubborn cowboy who refused to accept any solution that separated him from his wolf. The document represented something unprecedented in federal wildlife law, a compromise that acknowledged both legal obligations and emotional bonds, written in language that honored multiple forms of justice. Agent Winters sat cross-legged on the cave floor, her federal authority temporarily set aside in favor of human problem-solving. Across from her, Emma worked through legal language, while Thomas provided tribal law perspective and David offered federal regulatory expertise. Hank remained at the cave mouth with Dusty, watching the media circus below while listening to terms that would reshape his life in ways he was still trying to understand. "The ambassador program has precedent," Agent Winters explained, reading from notes she'd taken during phone calls with her superiors. "We've used individual animals as educational ambassadors before, wolves that can't be released into the wild, but serve conservation purposes through public education." "What would that mean for Dusty?" Hank asked. "It means he becomes a federal conservation asset," Emma translated, looking up from her writing. "But instead of being relocated to a government facility, he remains here under your care as his designated handler." "There are conditions," David added, his voice still carrying the weight of guilt over his deception. "The property would need to be designated as a conservation preserve. You'd have federal oversight, regular inspections, and educational requirements." Thomas nodded approvingly. "The Tribal Council is prepared to designate the border area as sacred land, which provides additional legal protection. No commercial development, no mineral extraction, no interference with wildlife corridors." The Biogenesis Corporation representative, a woman in an expensive suit who'd introduced herself as Dr. Linda Harrison, had been notably quiet during the negotiations, but when conservation funding came up, she leaned forward with the focused attention of someone preparing to make an offer. Biogenesis is prepared to fund the conservation preserve at a level that would make it financially sustainable, she said. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar endowment for education, research, and habitat preservation. In exchange for what? Hank asked suspiciously. Non-invasive genetic sampling for research purposes, regular health monitoring that benefits Dusty while contributing to species preservation science. And if Dusty ever chooses to breed, if a suitable female is located and natural bonding occurs, his offspring would participate in the official recovery program. Emma looked up from her writing, the key phrase being, if he chooses. This agreement recognizes Dusty's agency in mating decisions. Wolves choose their own mates, Joseph added from his position near the cave paintings. Any breeding program that forces pairing goes against natural law. Agent Winters consulted her notes again. The Department of Interior has agreed to experimental status for this arrangement. If it works, if Dusty serves effectively as an ambassador while remaining bonded to Mr. Barlow, it could become a model for other human-wildlife partnerships. And if it doesn't work, Hank asked, then the standard protocols apply. Relocation to an official breeding facility or wildlife sanctuary. Dusty seemed to sense that his future was being decided, moving closer to Hank and resting his massive head against the rancher's leg. The gesture was simple but profound. A wolf choosing his pack in front of witnesses who would legally record that choice. There's one more element, Thomas said, unfolding a map of the area. The Tribal Council has agreed to extend reservation boundaries to include your entire property. This creates a legal sanctuary where traditional laws apply alongside federal regulations. Emma's pen moved quickly across the legal pad, translating negotiations into binding language. Dad, this would make you the official caretaker of a federal conservation preserve on sovereign tribal land, with corporate funding and international oversight. It's not the quiet ranch life you've been living, but Dusty stays with me. Dusty stays with you. Dr. Harrison cleared her throat. There would also be significant compensation for your cooperation. The conservation value of this arrangement justifies substantial payment for your caretaking services. Hank thought about the empty house, the silent evenings, the gradual decay of a property that had once buzzed with family life. The prospect of transformation, becoming something larger than a retired rancher nursing old wounds, felt both terrifying and strangely appealing. What about visitors? He asked. Education. Programs mean people coming to the ranch. School groups, researchers, conservation tourists, Agent Winters confirmed. You'd become a spokesperson for human-wildlife coexistence. Your story would help other people understand that conservation isn't about keeping humans and animals separate. It's about finding ways to honor both. Emma looked up from her writing, her eyes bright with something that looked like pride. Dad, you'd be teaching people what you've learned about healing, about how rescuing something wild can rescue the person doing the rescuing. The ancient cave paintings seemed to pulse with approval as Hank considered a future where his isolation would end, not through loss, but through purpose. The fossilized paw print that had matched Dusty's foot perfectly suggested that this partnership had always been meant to happen, that the bond between them was part of something larger than federal law or corporate interests. There's one condition. Hank said finally. Emma has to be involved, not just as a legal advisor, but as part of the preserve. Her mother always said this land would need someone from the next generation to keep it alive. Emma's eyes filled with tears. Dad, I have a job in Phoenix, a life there. The preserve would need legal counsel, Thomas interjected. Ongoing representation for regulatory compliance, tribal law coordination, federal interface. It's a full-time position if you want it to be. What about David? Dr. Harrison asked pointedly. His expertise in federal wildlife law would be valuable. For this kind of operation, Emma looked at her former fiancé, who had remained largely silent during the negotiations. When she spoke, her voice was measured but final. David's expertise might be valuable, but his integrity is compromised. Trust is the foundation of any partnership, and that foundation is broken. David's face crumpled with what looked like genuine remorse, but he nodded, acceptance of the judgment. Agent Winters stood and dusted off her pants. If everyone's in agreement, I need to make some phone calls. This arrangement will require authorization from multiple agencies, but I think we have enough consensus to make it work. As the negotiators dispersed to handle logistics, Hank remained in the cave with Dusty and the ancient paintings that had witnessed countless partnerships between humans and wolves. The handwritten agreement rustled in the desert wind, its carefully crafted compromises representing something unprecedented in the history of conservation law. "What do you think, boy?" Hank asked, scratching behind Dusty's ears. "Ready to become a federal employee?" Dusty's response was a soft exhale that sounded almost like contentment, as if he understood that sometimes the best solutions required everyone to become something they'd never imagined being. The new family photograph sat on Hank's kitchen table, where Sarah's old picture had once held vigil. But this image captured a different kind of healing. Emma laughing as Dusty investigated her camera equipment while her real partner Marcus documented wolf behavior for the conservation program, and Hank standing proudly beside the visitor center that had transformed his isolated ranch into a beacon of hope for human-wildlife coexistence. 6 months had passed since the confrontation at the ancient cave, and the Barlow Ranch Conservation Preserve had exceeded everyone's expectations. What had begun as a desperate compromise to keep a man and his wolf together had evolved into a model program that drew visitors from around the world, each one leaving with a deeper understanding of the bonds that connected all living things. Hank adjusted his ranger badge, an official designation that still felt strange after decades of avoiding government entanglements, and checked his watch. The afternoon tour group would arrive soon. 30 college students studying wildlife biology who'd driven from Phoenix specifically to meet the wolf who'd changed federal policy. Emma emerged from the visitor center carrying educational materials, her transition from city lawyer to preserve coordinator complete in ways that surprised them both. "The breeding program coordinator called," she said, settling beside her father on the porch where they'd shared so many conversations. "Luna arrived at the New Mexico facility yesterday. If she and Dusty bond naturally, we could see cubs by next spring." Luna was a young female Mexican gray wolf who'd been orphaned as a pup and raised in captivity, her genetic profile complementing Dusty's precious bloodlines perfectly. But the introduction would happen slowly, naturally, with no pressure beyond what their instincts provided. The federal breeding program had learned to honor wolf choice in ways that previous generations of conservation scientists had never imagined. "How's Dusty feeling about potential fatherhood?" Emma asked. "He's been restless lately," Hank admitted, "howling more at dawn, marking territory more aggressively. I think he knows something's changing." From the yard, Dusty lifted his magnificent head at the sound of his name, his coat now full and lustrous, with good health and purposeful living. The scars from his encounter with poachers had faded, but the wisdom in his yellow eyes had deepened through months of serving as ambassador to thousands of visitors who'd learned that wildness and domestication weren't mutually exclusive categories. Marcus appeared from behind the visitor center, camera equipment slung over his shoulder, and notebook filled with behavioral observations that would contribute to peer-reviewed research on human-wolf bonds. Emma's relationship with the wildlife photographer had developed naturally over shared work and genuine compatibility, built on truth rather than the deception that had poisoned her engagement to David. The film crew from National Geographic "Wants to schedule their final interviews next week," Marcus said, settling onto the porch steps. "They're particularly interested in documenting Dusty's reaction to meeting Luna." The documentary had been following their story since the federal agreement was signed, capturing the transformation of an isolated ranch into a conservation success story. But more importantly, it was documenting something that wildlife agencies were beginning to understand, that individual bonds between humans and animals could serve conservation goals more effectively than institutional programs that ignored emotional connections. Joseph Crowfeather's truck appeared on the horizon, raising a familiar dust cloud that had become a weekly sight since the preserve opened. The tribal elder had become an integral part of the education program, sharing traditional knowledge about wolves that complemented scientific research with indigenous wisdom. His presence reminded visitors that the relationship between humans and wolves was ancient, complex, and sacred in ways that transcended policy debates. "Joseph's bringing the youth group from the reservation school," Emma said, checking her schedule. 15 kids who want to learn traditional tracking methods and modern conservation science," Marcus added. "The combination is powerful, traditional knowledge informing contemporary research." Hank nodded, remembering his own childhood when tracking skills were survival tools rather than educational programs. The integration of old wisdom with new science had become a hallmark of the preserve, attracting researchers who understood that innovation required honoring what had worked for thousands of years. Dr. Chen's veterinary clinic had expanded to include a research component, with graduate students studying the physiological effects of human-wolf bonding on both species. Her preliminary findings suggested that Dusty's stress hormones had decreased significantly since the preserve opened, while Hank's own health markers, blood pressure, heart rate, depression indicators, had improved dramatically. "Speaking of research," Emma said, "the university wants to establish a field station here. Permanent housing for graduate students, laboratory facilities, long-term behavioral studies." "More changes," Hank observed, though his tone carried acceptance rather than resistance. "Good changes, though. Mom always said this land had the potential to teach people important things about living in harmony with the natural world." As if summoned by her mention, a photograph of Sarah caught the afternoon light from its place on the kitchen windowsill. But instead of the painful reminder it had once been, her image now felt like a blessing on the work they were doing. Confirmation that love could indeed create conditions where anything might grow. The first visitors of the afternoon began arriving. Families from Tucson, retirees from Colorado, international tourists whose understanding of American wildlife conservation would be shaped by what they experienced at the preserve. Hank straightened his uniform shirt and prepared to tell his story again, the tale of rescue that had become mutual salvation. "Still surprises me sometimes," he said to Emma as they watched Dusty greet the arriving children with patient dignity. "How saving one wounded animal turned into all this." "Maybe that's how all the best changes happen," Emma replied. "Someone makes one decent choice, and it ripples out in ways they never imagined." As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, painting the desert in the colors that had always meant home to Hank, he walked toward the old mining trail where his journey with Dusty had begun. The barbed wire that had once trapped a dying pup had been replaced by a bronze marker explaining the preserve's origins, but the essential truth remained unchanged. Sometimes the things we rescue end up rescuing us instead. Dusty fell into step beside him, their evening walk a ritual that had survived all the transformations of the past months. Together, they moved across landscape that now served a purpose larger than any individual claim, protected by laws that honored both legal obligations and emotional bonds. In the distance, Emma's laughter carried on the desert wind as she explained wolf behavior to fascinated visitors. The preserve hummed with purposeful activity, but at its heart remained the simple truth that had started it all: Love, properly tended, could grow into something that nourished not just individuals but entire communities. The new family photograph would be updated soon, when Luna arrived and possibly contributed cubs to their expanding pack. But the image it captured now, of healing made visible, of second chances fulfilled, of bonds that transcended species and transformed everything they touched, would remain as testimony to the power of one man's refusal to walk away from something that needed saving. The desert stars were emerging as Hank and Dusty completed their circuit, returning to a home that had become a sanctuary for more than just themselves. Tomorrow would bring new visitors, new stories, new opportunities to demonstrate that conservation wasn't about keeping humans and animals apart. It was about finding ways to honor the connections that had always existed between all living things. As they settled onto the porch for their evening vigil, Hank realized that Sarah had been right all along. Love did require the same attention as gardening. You couldn't force growth, but you could create conditions where it was not only possible but inevitable. And sometimes, if you were very fortunate, that growth would exceed anything you dared to imagine when you first planted the seeds.